For 23 years, he'd been Frank the mechanic, the man who could fix any engine and never overcharged anyone. His customers thought his steady hands came from years of working with tools. They didn't know those hands had once done very different work in the jungles of Vietnam. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful tale of hidden service and quiet heroism, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These narratives honor the warriors who found peace in everyday service. Miller's garage sat on the edge of downtown Millfield, a small brick building that had been serving the community's automotive needs for over 30 years. The hand-painted sign out front was faded but still readable, and the two service bays were always busy with cars, trucks, and farm equipment that kept the rural town moving. Frank Thompson had been the sole mechanic there for 23 years, ever since old Jim Miller had hired him in 1985, and discovered that the quiet man with calloused hands could diagnose any engine problem by sound alone. At 58, Frank was a fixture in the community. He was average height with graying brown hair kept short, wearing the same blue work shirt with Frank embroidered on the pocket every day. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and he moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd spent decades working with mechanical systems. The people of Millfield trusted Frank completely. He diagnosed problems honestly, fixed them efficiently, and charged fair prices. He could rebuild a transmission, tune a carburetor, or patch a radiator with equal skill. More importantly, he prioritized emergency repairs, like when Mrs. Peterson's car broke down on the way to her chemotherapy appointment. But Frank was also something of a mystery. He lived alone in a small house behind the garage, had never married, and seemed to have no family or close friends. He was polite but distant, helpful but never social. He'd fix your car and send you on your way with a nod and a brief smile, but he wouldn't engage in small talk. Most noticeably, Frank never talked about his past. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's history, Frank Thompson was a mystery. People knew he'd served in Vietnam. The time frame was obvious, and occasionally someone would notice the faded tattoo on his forearm. But whenever anyone asked about his service, Frank would change the subject or find urgent work that required his attention. "Frank's got ghosts," the older men in town would say. They'd seen other Vietnam veterans struggle with memories that wouldn't heal, and they respected Frank's silence. If he didn't want to talk about the war, that was his right. He'd served his country, and now he served his community. What they didn't know was that Frank's silence wasn't just about trauma. It was about classified operations that still couldn't be discussed, about missions in Laos and Cambodia that officially never happened. Frank Thompson had been Staff Sergeant Francis Thompson, 5th Special Forces Group, and for 18 months in 1971 and 1972, he'd conducted operations that required him to sign documents promising he'd never speak about what he'd done. Even 40 years later, Frank honored that promise. The nightmares had faded with time and steady work. The hypervigilance had settled into general awareness that served him well in diagnosing mechanical problems. The combat skills had been channeled into precise movements required to repair complex machinery. He had found peace in the orderly world of engines and transmissions, where problems had solutions and hard work produced predictable results. The morning of September 23rd started like any other Tuesday. Frank opened the garage at 7 a.m., made coffee, and began work on the day's scheduled repairs. He had Mrs. Garcia's Buick that needed a water pump, Tom Wilson's pickup with a transmission noise, and the Methodist Church's van due for maintenance. The work was methodical and satisfying. Frank had always found comfort in the logical progression of automotive repair: diagnosis, disassembly, replacement or repair, reassembly, testing. It was concrete work with measurable results, different from the ambiguous objectives that had characterized his military service. Around 10:30 a.m., Frank was under the hood of Mrs. Garcia's Buick when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It wasn't mechanical. It was the distinct whistle of incoming artillery that he'd learned to recognize in Southeast Asia. But this wasn't Vietnam, and there was no artillery in rural Ohio. Frank rolled out from under the car and looked toward the sound. The old chemical plant next to his garage, abandoned for 15 years but still containing industrial chemicals, was burning. That's when Frank realized the danger. The plant wasn't just an old building. It was a potential chemical disaster. If the fire reached the storage tanks in the basement, it could create an explosion that would level several city blocks. If certain chemicals mixed, it could create a toxic cloud that would make the area uninhabitable. Frank had spent enough time studying explosive devices and chemical weapons in Special Forces training to understand the magnitude of the threat. This wasn't just a fire. It was a pending catastrophe that could kill hundreds of people. He looked around quickly. The fire department was responding, but they were treating it as a standard structure fire. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. Frank was probably the only person in town who understood both the immediate danger and what needed to be done to prevent it. But that knowledge came from military training he'd never discussed and experiences he'd promised never to reveal. He made the decision that defined everything he'd learned about service and sacrifice. Frank walked quickly to his office and pulled a metal box from behind his filing cabinet. Inside was a radio that he'd maintained but never used, military maps of the local area, and credentials that identified him as a consultant for chemical weapons disposal. Credentials that were technically still valid, even though he'd never used them. Frank keyed the radio to a frequency that would reach the State Emergency Management Agency and began transmitting in the clear, professional tone he'd once used to coordinate airstrikes. This is Special Forces Consultant Thompson at the Millfield chemical plant fire. I'm declaring this a potential hazmat disaster. The building contains approximately 2,000 gallons of industrial acids, 500 gallons of volatile compounds, and unknown materials that could create toxic gas clouds. Current fire department response is insufficient. The response was immediate and skeptical. Sir, what are your credentials for making this assessment? Frank read off a series of numbers and codes that he'd memorized 40 years ago. There was a pause, then a different voice came on, older, more authoritative. Sergeant Thompson, this is Colonel Martinez, State Emergency Management. Your credentials check out. What's your assessment of the situation? Frank looked at the burning building, calculating distances, wind direction, and potential chemical reactions with the same precision he'd once used to plan demolition operations. Summer. Sir, I estimate 15 minutes before the fire reaches the basement storage area. If those chemicals mix and combust, you're looking at a blast radius of approximately 800 meters and a toxic cloud that could affect downtown. Current evacuation perimeter is insufficient. Understood. What's your recommendation for containment? Frank closed his eyes for a moment, accessing knowledge he'd spent decades trying to forget. The building has a basement access from the north side. If someone could reach the manual shutoff valves for the ventilation system and create a fire break around the storage tanks, it might prevent the chemicals from mixing. But it would require someone with explosive ordnance disposal training. Do you have that training, Sergeant? Frank looked at his garage, at the community he'd served quietly for over 2 decades, at the people who trusted him to fix their cars and never asked uncomfortable questions about his past. Yes, sir. I have that training. Then you're now the on-scene commander for chemical containment. Federal hazmat is en route, but they're 40 minutes out. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now. Frank Thompson hung up the radio and walked to another metal box he'd hoped never to open. Inside was equipment he'd maintained but never expected to use, a chemical detection kit, a basic protective mask, and a demolition timer that was older than most people in town but still functional. For 23 years, Frank the mechanic had been a peaceful man who fixed engines and minded his own business. But Staff Sergeant Francis Thompson, 5th Special Forces Group, had been trained for situations exactly like this. He walked to his truck, grabbed the emergency medical kit he'd always carried, and headed toward the burning building. The fire department chief tried to stop him at the perimeter. Sir, you can't go in there. It's too dangerous. Frank showed him the federal credentials that officially made him the ranking chemical weapons specialist on site. Chief, I need you to extend your evacuation perimeter and get everyone out now. I'm going to try to prevent this from becoming something much worse. What kind of worse? Frank looked at the building, calculating how much time he had before the situation became uncontainable. The kind where we lose most of downtown. The chief's face went pale. What do you need from us? Keep everyone back. Keep the water streams focused on the north side of the building, and if you see me running, Everyone else needs to be running too. Frank entered the building through a basement access point that had been hidden by vegetation growth. His chemical training told him he had maybe 10 minutes before the heat reached critical levels. His demolition experience told him exactly which walls needed to be brought down to create a fire break between different chemical storage areas. Working in the dark basement with only a flashlight, Frank moved with methodical precision. He located the ventilation shutoffs, sealed the connections between storage areas, and rigged a controlled demolition that would create a barrier between the most dangerous chemicals. But as he worked, Frank realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't an accidental fire. The burn patterns were wrong, the accelerant residue was too regular, and the timing was convenient. Someone had deliberately set this fire, probably hoping to create exactly the kind of disaster Frank was trying to prevent. He finished his containment work and started back toward the exit, but as he reached the stairs, he heard voices that didn't belong to firefighters or emergency personnel. Through the smoke, he could see two figures moving toward the storage area he'd just sealed, carrying what looked like additional incendiary devices. Frank Thompson made another decision that drew on 40 years of training and experience. He couldn't let them complete whatever they'd started. What followed in the basement of that abandoned chemical plant was a very brief encounter between two would-be terrorists and someone who'd spent 18 months learning to stop people exactly like them. Frank's Special Forces training hadn't faded with time. It had just been waiting for the right situation. When the federal hazmat team arrived 30 minutes later, they found a contained fire, a secured chemical storage area, and two unconscious suspects who were taken into custody on federal terrorism charges. Frank was sitting in his truck in the parking lot, drinking coffee and waiting to brief the team on the containment measures he'd implemented. The official report classified most of the details, but the investigation revealed that the attack had been planned by a domestic terrorist cell. Frank's intervention had prevented what could have been one of the worst domestic terrorism incidents in U.S. history. But Frank didn't want recognition or publicity. When the FBI offered to put him in witness protection, he declined. When the media tried to interview him, he referred all questions to federal authorities. When the town council wanted to give him a medal, he suggested they donate the money to the volunteer fire department. Frank Thompson went back to work at Miller's garage the next day, fixing engines and charging fair prices. But something had changed in the community's perception of their quiet mechanic. People looked at him with a new kind of respect, not intrusive or demanding, but acknowledging that they'd always known he was special and were grateful to finally understand why. The questions about Vietnam stopped completely. If Frank had secrets, they were clearly the kind that kept people safe. The community closed ranks around him, protecting his privacy with the same fierce loyalty he'd shown in protecting them. Mayor Wilson summarized the town's feelings at the next city council meeting. Frank Thompson has been taking care of this community for 23 years, just like he took care of his country before that. The least we can do is take care of him. Frank never talked about what had happened in that basement, just like he'd never talked about what had happened in Vietnam. But he didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than any words. A few months later, young Danny Martinez approached Frank while he was working on his family's car. Danny was 18, just graduated from high school, and considering military service. "Mr. Thompson," he said hesitantly, "I was wondering, I know you can't talk about it, but did you ever think the things you learned in the Army would help you here at home?" Frank looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, wiping his hands on a rag. "Son," he said quietly, "everything you learn in service becomes part of who you are. Whether it's fixing engines or fixing problems, the important thing is using what you know to help people." "So you think I should enlist?" Frank considered the question seriously. "I think you should find a way to serve, whether that's military or something else. But remember, the real heroes aren't the ones who get medals or recognition. They're the ones who do what needs to be done and then go back to their regular lives, knowing they made a difference." Danny nodded thoughtfully. "Like you do." Frank smiled, the same brief, modest smile his customers had seen for 23 years. "I just fix engines, son. Everything else is maintenance." But Danny understood, just like the rest of the community had come to understand. Frank Thompson was proof that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear work shirts and carry wrenches, and they serve their communities one repair at a time. The garage stayed busy, the town stayed safe, and Frank Thompson continued to be exactly what he'd always been, a man who used his skills to help people, whether those skills involved rebuilding carburetors or preventing chemical disasters. The only difference was that now everyone knew they could trust him with anything. Frank's story became part of Millfield's history, passed down not as legend, but as quiet fact. That heroes live among us, that service takes many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because good people refuse to let bad things happen to innocent neighbors. The garage sign still read Miller's Garage, and Frank still opened at 7 a.m. every morning. But everyone in town knew that they weren't just getting their cars fixed. They were being protected by someone who dedicated his life to making sure the people he cared about stayed safe, one day at a time, one repair at a time, one quiet act of heroism at a time. This story was brought to you by True Human Tales. Have you ever known someone whose quiet competence suggested hidden depths? Tell us about them in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to support the channel. We honor the silent guardians who continue serving one wrench at a time.